Hello everyone, I am recording this video to give you some feedback on this week's work. So this is going to be the work that you've been doing on worksheets 2 and 3. So worksheet 2 was a pre-reading worksheet on the 6 Napoleons, and worksheet 3 it was actually reading the first 2 chapters. So in this presentation we're going to look at some activities more in detail, and the other ones just providing you with the correct answers so you could have a look at them later and self-assess you. So the ones that we're going to have a look at actually are the Victorian era text, questions about the chapter, and the Napoleon diagram. So the other ones, the technology in the Victorian era and so on, you can revise them on your own, as I said. So to start with, the Victorian era text, as you can see here, I highlighted certain parts which answer the questions. Let's have a look at the first one. What was the Victorian era characterized by? So according to the text, it was a society characterized by class-based society. Also, there were many people who were able to vote. The economy grew. Britain became the most powerful empire in the world. Question 2. Look at here, is in a different order. Explain, what does the doctrine of the separate spheres mean? So the doctrine of separate spheres means that men and women were different and meant for different things. Men were independent and women were dependent. Men belong in the public sphere, women belong in the private sphere. Men were meant to participate in politics and paid work, while women were meant to run households and raise families. So this was the view of this time. Question 3. How important were race, religion, region, or occupation for the Victorian society? So these aspects were all meaningful according to the text. They were meaningful aspects of identity and status. However, we know that gender and class were more important. Question 4. Which 3 periods had the British economy? Well, in simple terms, there was a growth, then a decrease, and then again another growth in the economy. So this is what basically this was. Question 5. How were working conditions compared to the standards of living in Britain? Well, here let's separate things. The working conditions were actually harsh. They worked for long hours. While the standards of living in Britain were good, they were improving. Most families had more money to spend on alcohol, tobacco, or even paid vacations. So the standards of living were improving. Question 6. Why Britain was considered the cultural capital of the English-speaking world in this time? Well, let's remember that Britain was the most important empire in this time. So access made British cultural products were more important. So this is the first aspect. And also, we would say that they were very rich and varied in the different cultural products they produced. Question 7. What type of entertainment emerged during this time? So during this time we have a theater first, and music, which probably took the form of live performances in these music halls. Also, print culture was important. Here says large and diverse. And we could divide it into magazines and newspapers on the one hand, and novels or literature, let's say traditional literature, on the other hand. So let's have a look at now question 8. Which was the role of the newspaper and magazines in Britain in the 1880s? Well, here you could see in the green highlighter that the 1880s saw the emergence of the new journalism. What is this? What's this new journalism? That magazines and newspapers were writing about violent crimes and scandals in high society. So we could maybe we could maybe get to the conclusion that the newspapers in this time were not only the role of informing, the role was also maybe to entertain as well. Question 9. Which 2 types of novels were written in the Victorian era? What were the characteristics of the Victorian novel? So, well, the encyclopedia here says something interesting because there were these two type of novels, the ones for educated and well-off people or rich people, and other ones for less educated readers, which is a very interesting euphemism. But well, whatever. The other type of the characteristics of the Victorian novel were three, and these were that they were actually quite long, with complicated plots, often centered on marriages, and they had many characters. These are the characteristics. Well, you may know that the text had three more questions, 10, 11, and 12, but I'm not analyzing them here because these were opinion questions, and the idea was that you could write your own opinion here, and that this helps you to improve on your writing based on opinions and ideas. So the next activity, well, it's one that we are not going to look at very much because here you have the answer. You can self-assess yourself. But another indication of this activity was that you could think of a modern version of this technology. So for the first one, for the Telegram, someone suggested WhatsApp or instant messaging. I think that the Telegram spirit was more kind of given official information, so I would maybe relate it more to the email or something like that. Well, let's continue on the next activity, the consulting detective archetype. Well, we've discussed a lot about this archetype in the previous activities, but I wanted to emphasize this because this is important. All right, in these pictures, you could see several other aspects of the consulting detective archetype. So I think that you could have a look at this and see more of these aspects reflected on the archetype. The crossword. This is now the worksheet 3. Here you had to work on some of the vocabulary that are provided in Spanish, and you could see how this fits into this crossword. So here you have all of the answers. You can self-assess yourself. Let's have a look at the questions of the chapters 1 and 2. Question 1. Who was Inspector Lestrade? Inspector Lestrade was a police detective. He worked at Scotland Yard, and he was the police. He worked in Scotland Yard, as I said, the police headquarters in London. So probably he was a very important detective from the police. Let's remember that Sherlock Holmes, it is a detective, but a private consulting detective who likes to work on his own and not hired by certain institution. He likes to do the things on his own style. Question 2. What unusual things were happening in London? In this story, someone has been breaking Napoleon plaster busts. So this is the strange thing, because it was not just one, it is several, and the story says that maybe someone hates Napoleon a lot, or this is done by someone who is just simply mad. Question 3. Why was it a matter for the police? Well, here says because the person breaking the Napoleon bust is a criminal. He or she has broken into people's houses, has stolen the busts, and breaking them. So as you could see, there are at least 3 crimes here. So he is a criminal. That's why it is a matter for the police. Question 4. What happened in the shop belonging to Morse Hudson? Well, someone got into his shop while Hudson was in the back room and broke into pieces the Napoleon bust that was in the front of the shop. So here we have clearly identified which was the very first Napoleon bust which was broken. Questions 5 to 7. Let's have a look at question 5. What happened to Dr. Barnicot's 2 busts of Napoleon? Somebody during the night smashed the Napoleon bust of his house outside against a garden wall and smashed the Napoleon bust of his surgery on the floor. So basically these 2 busts were broken, were destroyed, smashed, and this is what happened. Question 6. Did the three busts of Napoleon look the same? Yes, they look exactly the same. The sculptor who made the three busts made them from the same mold. Question 7. What did Home ask Lestrade to do? Well, he asked Lestrade to tell them if anything else happened, probably to keep in contact, or maybe Holmes knew that something else was happening, or that this Napoleon breaker or person was going to commit the same crime again. Well, another activity I included was this small text, which was about what Napoleon good stuff could have done. And the purpose is to know why certain people would have admired this character in the story. Let's have a look. To start with, he ordered to construct a lot of infrastructure in Paris: roads, canals, and bridges. Also, he sponsored the Napoleonic Code, which forbade privileges between rich and the poor and gave equal rights for male citizens. It's important to know this because male citizens were the ones who run their households, and they are the ones who now have the rights upon women, which nowadays is not something good, but for that time it was an advancement. He also granted religious freedom. So this is something important because France is a Catholic country, and in this moment they would have welcomed anyone uh, who can go there. Finally, the Legion of Honor. What's this? This was a system that recognized merit instead of nobility. So this kind of a reward system for people who did something important for France or for Napoleon. So now, and finally, we go to the forum questions. These questions were posted from, if I'm not mistaken, from Friday to Monday. So you have the complete weekend to post your answers. We had some little participation, I would say, but interesting answers anyway. Let's have a look. First question. In the first chapter, Lestrade visits Holmes and asks for cooperation with his investigation. Is it important to cooperate as good citizens with the police? Well, in this question, everyone agreed. Everyone said yes, it is important to cooperate with the police. That makes us good citizens. If the investigation is important, of course. Question 2. As stated in this worksheet, Napoleon was a strong figure in providing rights for male citizens. Do you think was it wrong to give it equal rights to all men but not for women? Okay, so in this question we had an interesting discussion. The majority of people said that this was wrong because he forgot women and probably LGBTQ plus people. But in this case, you have to remember that before this, only the aristocracy had rights as citizens. Before that, nobody else had like any right. People were pretty much slaves. So Napoleon made a contribution, and that's something that we have to know. Question 3. As stated in this worksheet, Napoleon implemented a Legion of Honor based on merit. Do you think our societies need a reward system to become better citizens? So people here answered also that it's not necessary to have a reward to be a good citizen, and you should just be educated to be a good citizen from the start, which I agree. I think that you people are correct with these opinions. Question 4. Citizenship nowadays is a privilege in some countries. Do you think people who commit crimes should lose privileges guaranteed by citizenship? Okay, here people thought, well, the first opinion was, if I'm not mistaken, that in the case of severe crimes, yes, maybe this could be a good measure that this criminal may lose some privileges guaranteed by citizenship. While if these are minor crimes, it is not necessary, right? In question 5, the question was, in this chapter, 2 crimes at least were committed, which are property damage and home invasion. How can a good citizen deal with these crimes if he or she is affected by them? So here the answers were pretty much call the police. Of course, we would call the police if something else happens. But I wish that maybe we could have a larger discussion on what other things you could do in this case. Well, you know that the forum questions, their intention were to try to replicate what would happen in the classroom when we have these questions and everyone could contribute with their opinions. But in this case, we didn't have this opportunity, so the forum was intended to do that. So I hope that this can summarize and give you some ideas on what we are doing, and if you had some mistakes or something else, you could get back to the right track. So this is it. I hope that this have been helpful for you, and I wish that we could see again soon. So bye.